He's interviewed the Dalai Lama, Hugh Hefner, Margaret Thatcher, and countless others over his more than 25 years in TV. He's one of the most well-known faces of CNN. He's one of the most renowned business journalists in the world. I'm very happy to talk to Richard Quest today to try to find out what makes a good interview, makes a bad interview, and what you can do if you're stuck in a horrible situation. Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Before we go into the art of the interview, you've worked at the intersection of business and world affairs for decades now. President Biden just said that the time reminds him of the Cuba crisis in 1962. At the same time, we have inflation, we have energy crisis, we have a war in Ukraine. Is this the most tricky time that we've seen for business leaders maybe ever?
One always hesitates to say ever, but by far this is extremely difficult, and you have to look at why. We have had 12 to 14 years of cheap money. That cheap money is now being removed. We always knew it was going to be difficult, but to remove the accommodation, think about it, 2008, you have the banking crisis, the housing crisis, the banking crisis. Then you go into the European sovereign debt crisis, and you're really only just about repairing yourself from that when you end up with the pandemic. And on both occasions, central banks have to print money like they'd never printed before, and these were something unique occasions. And now you come out of the pandemic, and just as you hoped, that the environment, the geopolitical and economic environment, would be favorable to stop bond buying, raise interest rates, deal with that. The war in Ukraine, energy prices. And so, yes, I think this is one of the most difficult times for business because they are facing inflation, supply chain issues, all feeding each other, by the way. Inflation, supply chain issues, impossibility of getting workers, and a requirement of capital that's now becoming more expensive.
You kind of have two personalities in you. You have the journalist, for whom this might be the most interesting time ever, and then you're obviously also a world citizen, a traveler, where it might be a bit more concerning. Which personality, which role is bigger?
Oh, the two are the same.
Are they?
Yes, because I think that maybe that has changed in the last 30 years, where the quote, dispassionate journalist. But even then, I think if you look at the great journalists during the Second World War, they didn't give you their view, they didn't give you their opinion, they gave you their assessment. And that is crucial. I think there's a big misunderstanding between journalists who want to tell you what they think. And that's really a commentator, it's the opinion pages. That's not what I try to do. I try to give you an assessment. I'll give you an example. If I'm interviewing a minister, or I'm interviewing anybody about it, and I say to them, I've just got the latest increase in my mortgage at home. My mortgage at home, which isn't a big mortgage, has doubled. Now, is that dispassionate? Is that the journalist? Is that Richard Quest? It's not. It is bringing something into the interview that will make the interviewee realize, I know what I'm talking about, and at the same time will identify with the viewers who are having exactly the same problems. I was staggered when I saw how much electricity prices have gone up in London, in the UK. Now, I can hear somebody saying, oh, well, you can afford it. That's not the point. The point is I can recognize exactly the same problem that everybody else is recognizing.
If you were given the chance, what's a question or the first question you would ask President Putin?
Very good question, that. Bearing in mind bearing in mind the thousands of lives lost and the millions of lives ruined, disrupted, was it really necessary to do this?
And what do you assume he would answer?
Oh, yes. Yes, we have been trying, blah, 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 the Minsk Agreement, onwards and upwards. You know, this comes back to my fundamental point. He's never going to turn around to you, because no matter what you ask him, he's never going to turn around and say, do you know, Richard, you're right. This war was a terrible idea. In fact, it's not a special military operation. It's a war. I must call it a war, and I must immediately stop it. It's never going to happen. So what you can do is you can basically show the viewer the paucity and falseness of his position by saying things like, how many lives do you want to ruin because of this? At the end of the day, Ukraine posed no threat to you. And certainly, Mr. President, did Ukraine pose a threat worthy of this level of destruction? And he would answer, because he's not used to being questioned in such a way, he would answer about the greatness of Russia and the historical nature and the Second World War and the this and the Nazification and the denazification. You can't deal with it.
How much are you asking the question for yourself when you're in the TV studio, when you're asking world leaders?
Always.
And how much is it for representing the
Always.
viewers?
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing.
Is it?
Of course it is.
How
If I'm
come?
not interested, why would the viewer be? If I don't care, why should the viewer?
So the idea is, if you're interested, the viewer
I mean,
will
you
be
talk about
interested.
different subjects. I mean, if I have to do an interview with a CEO of a company I don't really care about, well, you know, I still have to vest myself in it. That's what the word of phrase I would use. Vesting myself in it. Make it so that I'm interested in this. I want to know the answer to what you say. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. Have there been occasions where I couldn't care a flying fart? Yes. And you still had to do the interview. Absolutely. And you try to do the best you can and not give it away. Have there been occasions where I've been so tired that I'm going over the fences? That's fine. That's fine, as long as I've done my job. But no, that's very rare. That's the unusual situation.
You use the analogy of ballroom dancing when talking about good interviews, and you just, in your talk, gave an example of maybe not an interview, but an interaction with Donald Trump and how tricky it was there. Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Well, I interviewed Donald Trump some years ago, a couple of times, and he had an ability to tell you black was white, and he had an
With
ability...
conviction, right? With conviction.
Whether he believes it or not, I don't know.
No, but the way he said
Oh,
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he's a big man to start with, so there's an intimidating presence.
Big in like
Physically. Physical presence. And he's a very wealthy man, and he's been successful in some areas. Not as successful as he'd like to believe he has been, as the New York Times pointed out. So in all of those things, but I think the biggest challenge that the rest of the world faced is that we'd never had anybody who didn't play by the same rules eventually. And most times leaders do accord to certain protocols and behaviours, and he didn't. And we didn't know how to respond to that.
How much preparation is needed when going into an interview? And is it the same thing if you're interviewing Hugh Hefner, the Dalai Lama, Donald Trump? Are you always prepared to your fingertips? Do you
What's the purpose
wing
of
it?
what's the purpose of the interview? That's the first question. So if I've got a CEO, say Kellogg's CEO on the programme, on Cresswin's Business, I've got 4 minutes live on air with them. What's the purpose of the interview? Well, the purpose of that interview today is to get his views on inflation, the demerger of the company, why it makes sense, and the general economic position and how he's worried. And that's going to be the scope of the interview. So now I will start preparing within that confines. Okay? I've decided that for today's interview, it's not GMO crops, or it's not, it might, so somebody will say, well, you haven't asked about climate change and ESGs. Well, you have to make a decision. If we ask about that, we won't be able to ask about that. So you make a decision, what's going to be the scope of the interview? And then you research those particular areas to make sure you have the ammunition necessary to prosecute your question. And that's how you have to think about it. I need the ammunition necessary to prosecute the question. And when I ask the question, and it's not so much with the CEO, but I want to make sure that I've set sufficient tram lines and guardrails that you can't go in a frolic of your own. Some people will anyway. There have been numerous occasions where I've asked the question inadvertently sloppily, and through no fault of their own, they've misunderstood, and they've gone off, and I've lost a minute and a half because, why did I add that last bit to the question? It wasn't necessary. So once you've decided this is the scope of the interview, then you can research the ammunition necessary, and then you actually can do the interview. Now, some years ago, when I was a junior reporter at the BBC, a junior financial reporter, and another reporter by the name of John Roberts, he said to me, I was only in my early 20s, he said to me, Richard, by the way, he said, there'll come a time when you'll turn up for an interview and you've got no idea about the company. You don't even know what they do. You have no idea whether they made a loss or a profit. You've just been shoved in a room and told, interview this person. Right?
Mm-hmm.
What would you ask? So, he said to me, the two questions. The first one you can always ask is, so Chairman, having seen these results, what were the factors, do you think, that influenced these results? And he will immediately lay out all the nasty things that hit them. The other question you can ask, which is always, so Chairman, how will you explain these results to shareholders? Again, he will immediately lay out everything. He'll say, well, this was a difficult year, and now you know they made a loss. And he will give you the ammunition that you need. Now, thankfully, I haven't had to use that very often, but I have had to use it, absolutely.
What's an interview that you would like to redo?
Oh.
One that stands out.
There isn't really one, because there's lots of one. Most interviews I wish I'd asked another question, or I'd asked the question that's in a different way.
And they come right after it, or like 10 days?
Yeah, because
years?
you realise, no, it was immediately afterwards. Either you've forgotten what you were supposed to ask, and that happens frequently.
Yeah.
The producer will say, don't forget to ask X, and you forget to ask X, and you walk out there. But quite often I'll watch an interview back, and there's not one that comes to mind, but I'll watch an interview back and I'll think I didn't get there. I got halfway there, but I didn't frame the question sufficiently tight enough. They were able to escape off to the left, or I should have gone to the right, or because I spent so long on this, I couldn't ask about that. I'm not I'm not too proud. My producer's in my ear. If it's a live program, my producer's in my ear, saying either ask about X, or keep going on this bit. Push them a bit harder on Y. Because you're in the middle of it. Frequently, I would say the norm is after I've finished an interview, particularly a sit-down interview like this, not so much a TV, somebody will say to me, what was the best bit? I can't remember. I was in the middle of it. I have no idea what we've just said. I knew what I had to do. I have no idea of what we just said. And unless it was something specifically very outrageous, but otherwise, no idea. And then I'll watch back. Yes, there was that. Yes. Now, there's a couple of really good gadgets that we now use for transcribing while the interview's going on. Otter and a couple of other things. So you can just pop it on the floor, and you can immediately see what was said. And that really helps you focus it. But there's nothing worse than realizing an interviewee's not going to answer, you're not going to make any progress, your time's almost up, and you've basically done a piss poor job.
And if you think back an interview where you said, that's the best I've ever done?
Oh, that Hefner, Swayze, Thatcher, you know that as soon as it's over. Soon, Bill Clinton.
Just a gut feeling.
Yeah. Even on a day-to-day basis. Bjorn Ulvaeus, I did several interviews with him recently down up in Stockholm. Numerous shoots for World of Wonder where I did opera singer ones where she got so into it she started singing. I interviewed, oh, I know, you want a more modest example? Scania Trucks. I interviewed the CEO of that, and he's answering. And as he's answering, I'm realizing, bloody hell, he's actually telling me what he thinks.
Mm-hmm.
He's actually telling me how difficult it is, the company at the moment. And as soon as I come, got it. Yes. And everybody, the producer, yes, we got it.
Who's someone dead or alive that you would have liked to interview and never got the chance? Maybe alive. Maybe make it a bit easier. Who's someone?
Well, no, dead or alive is really straightforward. It's Churchill.
Mm.
Churchill, absolutely. I mean, you know, you could always say Hitler or whatever, but I think that's an example of an interview that you're just going to hit over the head, hoping they're going to say they were wrong. But Churchill, you can draw out his failings, his weaknesses, his enormous strengths. Today, the person I'd really love to interview, always wanted to interview, Tom Cruise.
Why?
Because I think it must be fascinating. There's the controversy over it, but I think it's just because he is the best interviewees are those who have thought hard about their position. I don't care what your answer is, as long as it's a legitimate position that you hold and you've thought and you're passionate about it. So when I ask Patrick Swayze, what happens inside Patrick Swayze when the music starts? You know, from Dirty Dancing, he said, I just want to fly, or something like that. And then I asked Donald Trump, what happens when you smell a deal that's about to happen? And he looked at me and he said, it churns, it churns. And so what I would want to, I'm pretty sure, knowing what I know about him, Cruise, the way he does his own stunts, you saw the rant that he did during COVID after the rules were broken. There's a great interview to be done there that doesn't involve him jumping up on the sofa as he did with the famous Matt Lauer interview. So that's certainly one. I interviewed some years ago Madonna, and that was a fascinating interview because here was a woman who, during her Kabbalah period, had decided on had found a spiritual way of life, and she was going to answer the questions honestly, even though she didn't like them. And she did. I mean, she gave me a look as if to say, you know what you can do, but she answered them. And it does take you have to remember, you're not there to be their friend. Mm. You're there to do a job.
But would that mean that interviewing, let's say on the political spectrum, extremes is more interesting, more relevant, more
Well, what's the
fun
goal? Yeah,
than
but what's your
moderates?
goal? When you interview an extreme, what's your goal?
I'm sure they thought hard and long about the position and how to argue it.
Right. So what are you... Stop trying to be so pleased with yourself or oneself that you've got the interview. Mm. And start trying to think, what are we going to get out of it? What's the purpose of this interview? Fine, we've got the big name. Fine, we've got the extreme. Fine, we've got the guy. Fine, we've got it. Now what are we going to do with it? What's our goal here? And only when you've really worked at that, and it's not a single person, it's a group effort. It's the producers, it's the executive producer, it's the cameraman, who will all say, well, I want to know this, and we don't do that. And only once you've got to that level and depth can you really go and do the interview. Doesn't mean to say you can't do it before, but you won't get a very good interview. You've got to have thought about it. And I don't mean I'm going to ask this, and then I'm going to ask that, I'm going to ask the other. You've got to have thought about it. What do I want? What is the goal? What do I want to get out of it? And once you've decided that, then you can plan how you're going to interview them.
Final question, Richard. Best way to end an interview?
Oh, with a guest? With a TV interview?
Give me advice on how to end this interview.
It's easy. Right. So, well, TV, if it's a live interview. Okay, so let's say it's a live interview. And it's been a bit choppy. It's been a bit adversarial. you don't really want to end on bad terms. So what you do is you will then bring it back up again with something neutralish or something that you can both agree on so that you can come. I mean, if it's been a really bad interview, fine, just say goodbye. But otherwise, you try to, remember, very important in an interview, really significant to remember, the interviewee doesn't have to answer. They've got no obligation. I have no force of law to make people answer. I have no subpoena. I have no power of court. So now, once you've agreed to the interview and succumbed, you have a duty to make sure you don't lie and you do a good interview. But you don't have to answer my questions. So I have to show you respect. And if you're a politician, I need to remember, unlike me, you have to stand for election every 4 years or 3 years or whatever it is. I don't. So you have to show respect. If you're a CEO of a major corporation employing 100,000 employees, you have responsibilities. My only responsibility this morning was to make sure my socks and my underwear were clean and I got to the room on time. I don't have to worry about, is the steel going to arrive from Japan? How am I going to do a contract negotiation? The bonds are due on my debt. So start from a position of respect for the interviewee. They don't have to answer. Now, if you've had a really difficult interview, then try and bring it up nicely towards the end. Try and bring it to a sort of an ending of comedy. It doesn't have to be hoo-ha-ha-ha-ha. Maybe referred back to something that was earlier in the program. And then I tried to, and one of the things was great now about being in post-COVID. I did it before, now I can do it again. As the interview comes to an end, and so blah, 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 blah. It was difficult, wasn't it? But you enjoyed it, didn't you? So did you enjoy interviewing me?
I did.
You did?
Yes.
Was it fun?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, hopefully we'll get a chance to do it again. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you so
That's
much.
how you end the interview.
Thank you so much, Richard.
You let the person have the last word, you move over, you shake their hand so that it's all night, you're smiling, and then you sort of say, and then you just say, thank you very much. As we continue tonight on Quest Means Business after the break, why the minister said no, and the company went out of business. That's next. That's how you do it.
Thank you so much, Richard.